Hello, I'm here with another House of Night video. This time we are going to be talking about all of the age gap romances and student-teacher romances in this series because there are a lot. Now, before I get into the specifics of all the relationships, I'm going to try to talk about the intent or potential that could have been examined here, because this is a hard thing to talk about and I'm going to have to think about it in real time, because even when making my notes I couldn't make heads or tails of why you would do this. I think part of it is there is an element of wish fulfillment for young readers of imagining, especially in a vampire book, imagining, this ancient, cultured, intelligent, powerful being wanting to date little 16-year-old you, right? That's the appeal in books like Twilight and stuff like that. But also there's an element of some of these relationships are, yes, one of the people involved is a teacher, but they are a teacher who just finished school. So they're basically the same age as the person they're dating, maybe a year or two older, but they are also a teacher. We can have conversations about how do people become teachers in the House of Night, because I have questions about the pedagogy and standards and whatever. But for now, there is at least one character who's 18, 19, and he's a professor at the school, and he dates, 17-year-olds. And that, I think, is probably, it's a factor of not really thinking of that as a unbalanced relationship because the ages are so close, and not taking proper consideration for the fact that he's a teacher. Don't do that. And also, to an extent, it's a whole thing. I think a lot of people have probably had crushes on teachers or professors at some point in their life. And so that is also some element of wish fulfillment of imagine if you could date your teacher because they were your age, even though that's not strictly the reason why you shouldn't date a teacher, whatever. So those are some broad ideas of kind of the mentality that might exist behind some of these relationships. I'm realizing that it's probably going to make more sense for me to go through each kind of category or example of age gap and student-teacher romances, and then explain what I think maybe the intent was and what the actual implications are, because there's a lot of different examples. There's a lot of age gap romances, and so it's a little hard to talk about the implications without getting into the specifics of each relationship. So I'm just going to do that. Sorry for how this is already feeling a bit disorganized, but whatever, it'll be fine. The first relationship I want to talk about is the first one that happens, and that is our main character, Zoe Redbird, with a professor, Lauren Blake. He is a young professor. He's 25, I think, but Zoe is 16 going on 17. She turns 17 when she is involved with him. So that's even just that age, ignoring the fact that he's her professor. No, you can't do that. That's bad. But also, he is her professor. He works at her school. And the thing with this relationship is that per PC Cast, she says, she has said on social media and probably in an interview somewhere, that Zoe was not assaulted. She does not consider, because Zoe and Lauren have sex, and she says that was not assault. Zoe consented. It was a predatory relationship, but Zoe was not assaulted. Now, here's the problem with that. One, the text does not adequately present Lauren as predatory. In the text, Zoe, in conversation with Stevie Ray, talks about how, well, maybe it's okay that I'm involved with Lauren because I'm so different from everyone. My mark is more expanded and filled in than normal, which marks me as more advanced in the change than a fledgling should be at my stage. And I am, more mature and wiser. I'm the eyes and ears of the goddess. So maybe it is fine that I have this relationship because I'm not like other girls. Literally, she's not like other girls. So maybe it's fine to have this relationship, which I, as an adult reading the text, I can look at that and especially when Lauren is saying the same kinds of things to her, I can recognize that as oh, that's grooming. Lauren is preying on Zoe's difference and sense of being apart from others to, emphasize that she's so special and she's so important and she's so mature. So of course they should be together. She deserves this kind of attention and praise and whatever. But looking at the text, like as the text is written and imagining reading it at that age, at, the target age group is like 13 to 17. And imagining reading this book when I'm in middle school or high school, it would not have come across in the text that Lauren is predatory. And even after the events of the relationship unfold, when Zoe reflects on it, she doesn't think of it as, oh, I shouldn't have been involved with Lauren because he's so much older than me and he's my professor. Instead, it's, oh, Lauren lied to and seduced me. He was involved with Neferet the whole time and he was a villain. And so it doesn't send the right message to readers, and it doesn't come across with the intent that PC Cast explicitly intended, as she has stated outside of the text. And it ends up normalizing or even encouraging the idea that, yes, if you are really special and mature and unique, it is okay for you to have a relationship with someone who's much older than you, because you're more mature, you should be with someone older. And the danger is if this older mature person is involved with a evil vampire who's allied with darkness, which obviously in real world would never happen. But in real world, there are teen girls who get involved with their teachers. So to me, that's a dangerous message to have in the book. Like, that's a dangerous thing to try and normalize, or not try to normalize, but unintentionally normalize. And that's our first age gap and student-teacher romance in the books. So we did not set a good foundation for this. So it's hard to figure out what order to talk about things in because there's so many examples. I think the next one I want to talk about is Eric. So Eric is 18 or 19, and in the course of the series, he completes the change, which means he transforms from a fledgling into a full adult vampire. And when that happens, he's done being a student at the House of Night. Again, I don't know how this curriculum works. Sure. And then for reasons in the next book, he is now a professor at the House of Night. This is a week after he completes the change, if that. Again, I'm not super clear on how that works. But he becomes a professor. And he's specifically Zoe's professor. He and Zoe had been dating. He found out Zoe was involved with Lauren. He broke up with her. And then after becoming her professor, there's things that happen. I'm not going to get into all of it because some of it kind of is supposed to be a little messed up, but basically while he is a professor, he and Zoe end up dating again. So Zoe is dating a professor who's almost the same age as her, but he's a professor, and he's specifically her professor. He teaches one of her classes. They end up breaking up again, not related to him being her professor. That's never presented as really a problem. Then he later, for a time, is interested in Shaylin, who is also a student at House of Night while he is a professor. But moreover, on top of that, he is a professor and he became a tracker, which is someone who marks new fledglings. And so he marks her, but there's things that go weird when he marks her. She's marked in red instead of blue. And so normally a tracker would mark a fledgling and then just disappear and leave the fledgling to find their way to the House of Night. But he stays with her and he takes an interest in her. So he has kind of a double level of weird power dynamics over Shaylin, because he's not only the person who marked her and escorted her to the House of Night and has this kind of unique position over her compared to literally anyone else, but also he's a professor at her school. And he is very interested in her, and there's a moment where he tries to kiss her, and they don't end up dating, but there are there's a handful of scenes implying that they would end up dating. They don't end up dating because PC Guest decided she needed a lesbian relationship, so she made Shaylin gay. And I say, in my queer video, I talk about that more, but it's literally it doesn't make any sense. It comes from nowhere. There's all this buildup between Shaylin and Eric, and then the next book she has a conversation with Nicole, and suddenly they're in love. Again, I have a whole other video about that. But so that's a second student that Eric takes an interest in. takes an interest in. And then after that, Eric takes an interest in Shawnee, who at the time that he takes an interest in her is a student at his school. I think she is in one of his classes because I'm pretty sure he teaches poetry, and she previously had talked about being in the poetry elective when Lauren was teaching poetry. Every relationship that he has after he completes the change and becomes a professor is with a student. The person that he's interested in is a student at the time that he takes an interest in them. So that's like a weird thing to do. And again, like I kind of talked about this a bit previously, but this is an example of, I think PC Cast just wasn't thinking about the professor dynamic in these relationships. She was just thinking about the fact that, well, Eric is a teenager, so he can date teenagers. But like, it's a problem because, and I will get into this a little bit, I guess, before he and Zoe get back together, he uses his position as her drama teacher to force her to engage in a monologue with him where he is physically aggressive to her, verbally threatens her, and grabs her and kisses her in front of the entire class. And like, yes, it's part of a monologue, but like, he and Zoe know that there's history between them and that this isn't actually about the monologue. He is speaking to her through the monologue. And so this isn't just acting, this is him acting against her, and he's using his position as a professor to do it. And that happens before any of the situations where he's pursuing students. So it's a really weird dynamic. And again, with the precedent of Lauren, like, it just sends a weird message to readers about like the power dynamic of a student and a professor and being able to date them, where there just isn't really any conversations in these books about like, hey, I know that person's your professor. I know they're hot. I know you think you have chemistry with them. I know they're young. They're still your professor. You can't date them. That's just not a thing that's addressed anywhere. So this is like a compounding issue over the course of the series. And I think Eric in some ways really makes it worse because he is so young and it's presented as so normal, but he also like specifically uses his position against Zoe in that scene, but like against the students that he is pursuing. Another one that's kind of weird is Darius and Aphrodite. Aphrodite is like 18 or 19. She's 18 at the start of the series. And Darius, when he's first introduced, is emphasized as seeming really young and like he is a warrior who has recently completed the change. So presumably he's, 2021. Like, he's pretty young. I'm just like, okay, 18-year-old with like someone in their very early 20s, that's fine. That's not so bad. That's the kind of relationship you could see in university kind of situation. And he's not in a position of particular authority over Aphrodite. He's serving the campus basically as security. He's there to protect them. So he's not in a specific position of authority over Aphrodite. If anything, he answers to her because she is a prophetess. But then later, like over halfway through the original series, characters start talking about Darius as if he's very mature, like talking about him being a warrior for decades. And then in the spin-off Otherworld series, Darius specifically says, hold on, let me check the age. He is revealed to be in his 80s. And the thing is, there's an element of, this is a fantasy world where, there's 200-year-old vampires. A 200-year-old dating an 18-year-old is never going to happen in real life because people don't live to be 200. But an 80-year-old dating an 18-year-old is a thing. And like, even if we don't go by the literal age of 80, the dynamic that's presented is here's a mature, older, worldly man. He has years under his belt, decades more experience in life under his belt. And he's with an 18-year-old. And that's being presented as like romantic and very like this sweeping, beautiful romance. And he understands her so well because he's so mature. And like, I want to like the dynamic between Darius and Aphrodite, and I did like it when Darius was presented as young. But retconning him to be so much older than her instead makes it really uncomfortable, because now suddenly he's this way more mature man who is engaging in a relationship with a woman who he knows to be vulnerable, and she comes from an unhappy home, and she has a lot of emotional turmoil and feels unloved and unworthy. And he's, from the perspective of looking at him as an older man, he's preying on that. And so that creates a really uncomfortable dynamic. There's also a thing with, there's this very minor side character introduced named Adam Palooka, who is an anchor for the local news, and he and Damien briefly date. They break up off screen in between the original series and the Otherworld series. And that's like, even in text, it feels a little weird, because it's like, okay, he's a news anchor. How old is he? Damien's like 17. But in real world, Adam Palooka's a real person. And at the time that the series was written, like when that book was released that he's introduced in, he was 27. And so PC Cast wrote in a 27-year-old to date one of her characters who's like maybe 17. And that's presented as like, there's no comment whatsoever on that age gap. And so again, it's presented as really normal for a much older man to be dating a high school student. And in this case, Damien is like fresh off an extremely traumatic loss. His boyfriend had died gruesomely, and this mature older man is now like making moves on him. And like, we don't see a lot of it. It's mostly other characters observing Damien and Adam and talking about them like it's some kind of nature documentary. But the implications here are uncomfortable. And again, like on its own, it's just kind of like, I don't know if I like that. But in tandem with everything else that's happening with these age gap romances and these student-teacher romances, it's like, why do we keep doing this? This is so uncomfortable. And we have a similar situation with other Aphrodite in the Otherworld series. Original Aphrodite's age is retconned to be 21 so that she can legally drink, because the first book has her being an alcoholic, even though she was also an alcoholic in the original series, and that was fine. Like, her drinking, it doesn't make any sense. But they retconned her age to 21, even though she should only be like 19, maybe 20. But that means that other Aphrodite is also 21. And other Aphrodite pursues a relationship with other Kevin, who is 16. He says, I'll be 17 in, I think, August. But the book takes place in December. So it's like more than half a year before he will turn 17. A 16-year-old dating a 21-year-old is incredibly inappropriate. That's a 5-year age gap for a teenager. He's in high school. He would be, what is 16? Maybe 11th grade? No, 10th grade, I think. And Aphrodite would be equivalent to 3rd or 4th year university. So, like, that's not appropriate. And the book actually comments on that age difference, but the way it's waved away is that Kevin goes, well, but I've been through so much so young that I'm really mature for my age. And that's like kind of the same thing that's done with Zoe and Lauren, except in this case, it isn't presented as wrong in any form, even out of text. This is supposed to be a beautiful romance. The idea of saying that a 16-year-old and a 21-year-old are on some level soulmates is really uncomfortable. Again, especially in tandem with everything else happening with age gaps in this series. There's another one that can be more easily waved away as like, yeah, it's fantasy age differences, it's fine, where Rephaim is over 1,000 years old and Stevie Ray is like 17. And that one I have an easier time excusing, because like, yes, Rephaim is 1,000 years old, but most of that time he was like a disembodied spirit, just kind of around. He wasn't really living fully. So like, you can argue that he's actually quite young. But I did want to note that like, that is also an age gap romance technically. Oh, jumping back to other Aphrodite, sorry. There's also there is out of text stuff with other Aphrodite. I need to read this because I wrote it down because it's from like an interview that PC Cast did. So Aphrodite, as a prophetess of redemption, will turn human again when she burns through her mark. So every time she gives someone a second chance, a piece of her mark disappears. Per PC Cast, in discussion with Mysterious Galaxy before the release of Found, Aphrodite will live a long time as a vampire, outliving Darius, before turning human again and being physically in her 30s or 40s. Aphrodite will likely have a human partner. We know Aphrodite will have a human partner because there's a reference in text to Aphrodite having like children and grandchildren and stuff. That means that Aphrodite will have lived hundreds of years, probably up to 200 years old or something. And then she will, a tab fell out of my notebook. And then she will look 30 or 40 and presumably date a human who is 30 or 40. Or even younger, because this book loves putting, 18, 20-year-olds with 200-year-old vampires. And so that means that Aphrodite is like predestined to be in an uncomfortable age gap romance after other Aphrodite having an uncomfortable age gap romance. This is original Aphrodite. I don't know if I said that clearly. But, so that's like, even things that aren't happening in text, we're supposed to see this as a like, kind of, beautiful, hopeful future for Aphrodite, that she gets to have all this love. She gets to not only have a full life with Darius, but then turn human again and live a full human life with a human partner. But it's like, okay, but she's going to be 200 when she's with her, presumably 200 when she's with her human partner. So, what are we doing? Hi, Editing Rachel here. I want to revisit this subject a little bit because I kind of jumped to a conclusion here when I was saying that Aphrodite will be 200 when she's dating a human. We don't know that. We just know that vampires can easily live to be 200. And so if Aphrodite doesn't burn through her mark until late into her vampiric lifespan, she could be about 200 years old before she reverts to human and then has her human lifespan. But regardless, like, Aphrodite will probably live several decades as a vampire and then revert to human and continue out her life as if she is a 30-year-old human, and then, can finish off a human lifespan and have a relationship with a human. So even if Aphrodite only lives, let's say she is like essentially 100 years old as a vampire and then reverts to human, that still means that she would be 100 years old. And if she's dating someone who by appearances is the same age as her human form, she's going to be dating like a 30-year-old when she's like 100. So, like, regardless of how you frame it, it's just weird. It's very much, again, on its own, it wouldn't bother me, but in tandem with everything else going on, it's just yet another example of like this intense fixation, because it seems like a fixation at this point with having these relationships with huge age gaps. The more beautiful and sweeping the romance, the bigger the age gap, it almost feels like. Now I want to jump to talking about the Nephirites, other Nephirite and original Nephirite, because there's a lot to unpack here. In the last book of the series, Original Nephirite condones and encourages a middle-aged woman that she's holding hostage. She's talking about, like, she reads the woman's mind and she's talking about, like, oh, you should have drank more wine and you should have, indulged in more pasta instead of worrying about your weight, and you should have slept with your neighbor's young son more than once. And I'm like, how young are we talking? Because this woman is like in her 40s or 50s. And so young son makes me think like high school or maybe college age. And so it's like, did this middle-aged woman sleep with an 18-year-old? And Nephirite is saying she should have done it more. And notably, in the context of this, yes, Nephirite is a villain. Yes, sometimes Nephirite says and does things that are not, even though she's condoning them, the text makes it clear that's not good. You shouldn't do that, actually. Nephirite's evil. In this case, it's framed by things that, yes, you should have done. Yes, she should have, enjoyed things in life more, like wine and pasta. So putting that next to, you should have slept with this probably teenager more as an older woman, is like weird and uncomfortable, especially because in another series PC Cast wrote, the Into the Mist duology, we have this exchange. The first book, Into the Mist, Stella, who is 45, and Mercury, who's in her 30s, have the following conversation about Tyler, who is 18. "Ah, youth," said Stella. "He's lucky I'm not a decade younger. My line is at 30 years young, though." "Well, it is the apocalypse." Mercury waggled her brows suggestively. So Mercury, who I must note, Mercury is explicitly stated by PC Cast to be a version of herself when she was a young teacher. This is an insert of PC Cast in her 30s. So PC Cast in her 30s as a character is looking at this woman in her 40s and saying, well, I think it's fine if you sleep with an 18-year-old. Both of these characters are high school teachers. The boy that they are talking about Stella sleeping with is the same age as some of their students. And PC Cast was a high school teacher. So she also taught students this age. That's a lot to unpack. But also Tyler, still 18, in the next book, is confirmed to end up in a relationship with Jenny, who is 25. So we are again having a teenager in a relationship with someone much older than him. Jenny is 7 years older than him and also taught high school. So, like, there's a trend of having, I mean, Jenny's not, like, a middle-aged woman, but having older women, especially much older women, sleeping with very young men, borderline minors. Like, it's right on the edge of him being a minor. He is 18. So, like, this is uncomfortable not only because of the context of everything else that's happening in the series with all these age gaps and student-teacher romances, but also because of, you know, the shit that happened to the Into the Mist duology, and the fact that PC Cast was a teacher. She was a high school teacher. The first couple books of this series, she was still teaching high school. So her writing, and especially writing positively, student-teacher romances and presenting them as romantic, again, especially in the examples of, you know, people who are in their, you know, who are normal human ages, dating teenagers, like 18-year-olds, is really, really uncomfortable. And it makes me really, really uncomfortable to think about the fact that she wrote that as a high school teacher. Why? And then this is furthered with other Neferet in that it's emphasized that she has lots of relationships with all of her officers. And this includes Other Stark, who is 18, and like Other Neferet is 200 years old. So again, yes, technically we can write this off as a fantasy age gap, but the context of it is like there are so many examples of much older people being in relationships with teenagers, especially teenagers they are in positions of authority over. Neferet is the high priestess of the school. She's in command of the army, and she is dating an 18-year-old officer who is like subservient to her. He has to take her orders. And it's presented as gross in that like they think Neferet is gross, and so the idea of Stark sleeping with Neferet is gross and uncomfortable. It's not presented as gross because of the age or because of the position of authority. So again, we're doing the same thing over and over and over again. Last but certainly not least, Other Neferet prefers young feeders, and there's specifically an example on page where she's feeding from a young man named Robbie, who's 18 years old, and she, like, it fades to black before she feeds on him, but she asks him to get undressed, and feeding in the House of Night world has it doesn't have to be sexual, but it, like, there is erotic pleasure derived from feeding, and so for Other Neferet to ask this 18-year-old to get undressed before it fades to black for a feeding scene implies that this isn't just about sustaining herself on blood. Like, there is, like, she has sex with this 18-year-old. Sorry, I keep hearing my neighbors. It's just, there is a trend in this series of much older people having relationships with teenagers, especially their students, and this never really being presented as inappropriate or potentially predatory or abusive. And that's concerning for a number of reasons. One, just the fact that this is a book targeted at young readers. Like, the target demographic for this book is like high school students, so the people who are at risk of being preyed on by teachers. Like, it's a really weird choice to present that as romantic or normal or just fine. And on top of that, there's also the like kind of out of text context of PC Cast as a teacher, or in the later books, retired teacher, who taught teenagers, who worked in a high school and would have been teaching people between the ages of, I don't know, 14 to 18. And her looking at all these relationships and being like, yeah, it is totally fine that 21-year-old Aphrodite wants to date 16-year-old Kevin. It's totally fine that, this middle-aged woman slept with her neighbor's son of an unclear age, but specifically young. It's totally fine in Into the Mist that 45-year-old Stella wants to sleep with 18-year-old Tyler. Like, it's a really, really weird and uncomfortable trend, not just in the House of Night series, but in her writing. And I think that in terms of what a do-over would look like, maybe just don't do any of those. Some characters need to be aged down, some characters need to be aged up. There shouldn't be student-teacher romances, or if there are, that should be a very, very serious point of contention in the relationship. The only case where I can kind of justify it is Eric and Zoe, because Eric and Zoe did date before he became a teacher. So there is some, like, in real world, I would be like, that's still kind of weird. Maybe don't do that. But in the context of a fictional world, I could kind of see, like, there is no reality in which, oh, yeah, I was, as a 17-year-old, dating this 18-year-old, and then he suddenly transformed, and the next week he was my professor. Like, that's not gonna happen. So, like, their age dynamic is fine, and the fact that he's her professor could have worked. Like, it would still have to be addressed and acknowledged, but it's the kind of thing that I could have seen them justifying and trying to work through. But basically every other student-teacher romance is like, why are we doing that though? Why are we doing that? And I think all of the weird shit with making not other Neferet condoning a woman for sleeping with her neighbor's young son should not have been put in the text, or if it was put in the text, it should have been recontextualized to make it clear that we should not agree with her, because you shouldn't do that. Like, I don't have specific examples of how this could have been done. I mean, I do have a specific example. Aphrodite should not have been aged up. If Aphrodite was just 19 and Kevin was actually 17 instead of saying he's almost 17 when he is in fact more than half a year away from being 17, that wouldn't have been so bad. A 19-year-old and a 17-year-old I can deal with. But they aged her up and then decided to make him so young that I'm just kind of like, why? Like, there's no need for there to be, I don't remember there being a clearly established age gap between Zoe and Kevin in the original series. And if there was, I would be okay with that retcon. I would rather Kevin's age be retconned to be a little older versus Aphrodite's age being retconned to older, because that would make the relationship less weird. And I just, in general, I think there should have been more. It could have been an interesting world-building element to explore vampires' positions and perspectives on age gap romances. Because when you have a species that is so long-lived, and they do sometimes have relationships with humans, yes, certainly there is some context for the idea of maybe this 130-year-old vampire is like, I've got a good 70 years left in me. I don't want to date a human who's 60 years old, because they're going to die real soon. I want to date the human who also has 60 or 70 years left in them. So I'm going to date a 20-year-old. And like, having some sort of cultural or ethical examination of what that means for vampires would have been interesting. And it also, like, even if it was just a few comments here or there, and it was never like super deeply grappled with, I would have appreciated that, and it would have lended a bit more context and at least some sign of like addressing it. And I like, it just would have worked better than just pretending that this is fine. And it would have been an interesting world building opportunity. I would like to see more about what does it mean to be a long-lived species. I just think like there needed to be more thought put into these age gaps, because it's really clear that for the most part, PC Cash just didn't think about ages, I don't think. She was just like, I think these characters would be fun together, and just kind of slap them together. And unfortunately, that mostly doesn't work because the age gaps are neither big enough to be okay, like in a fantasy world sense, or they're like, yes, the age gap is small and you could maybe make that okay, but then you made them like student teachers, so it's not okay. And yeah, I wish there had been more thought put into it and more intentionality. But I think that is all I have to say on this topic. It is a doozy. For emojis, God, what emoji do I want you to put in the comment of this video? Put a teacher emoji, I guess? That feels a little wrong, but sure, put a teacher emoji in the comments for this video about inappropriate student-teacher romances. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Okay, bye!